Welcome to the fifth video on ancient Greece. Today we are going to be examining the Greek Phalanx, the style of warfare for the ancient Greeks, and its fundamental role in Greek warfare. But before we do that, I would like to talk about the Phalanx in relation to the polis. Now, in the last video, I talked about the polis and its development from 8th century BC as a key development in archaic Greece. Sometime in archaic Greece, the Phalanx is developed. As always in these earlier times, we don't have an exact date, but I think we can infer that it developed alongside the polis. So let's talk about the ancient hoplite warrior. The composition of the Phalanx was quite unique in comparison to other empires around the Mediterranean during this time. The Phalanx consisted of individuals working on the various farms and farmland that surrounded the polis. We can generally say it started sometime around 750, but again, these start dates are very controversial. It seems to be a natural development since an invader would likely attack the farms first when invading a countryside, so it made sense that the individuals working and running these farms would be the first to defend and fight for a common cause. And that common cause was the polis, which was the lifeline of their existence. So they are fighting for their city. And if they are victorious, they will be honored by their polis. And pride and honor are always the key to understanding the hoplite warrior. So, allegiance to a city was considered the most important value or ethos to a Greek warrior, perhaps even above the individual. Though it's complicated, as on an individual basis, the Greek infantryman was expected to excel as an individual warrior. And if he excelled in battle, he would be considered a hero and given a huge amount of respect and honor that he had earned. He would also be remembered, which is everything to the Greeks. So if you were successful, you helped not only your family, but your polis and your reputation as well. So the Greeks fought to get that most sought after glory and honor. And on an individual basis, the Greeks competed greatly to achieve that end. The opposite of glory and honor was shame to the Greek, and that was about the worst thing possible that could happen to a Greek hoplite. If you ran from the battle or underperformed, this was looked at as shameful, and shame was an absolute terrible thing, again, for the Greek. So again, the Greeks loved everything military, and so war is at the center of every Greek society. And the polis provided the political and social support that was necessary to create an army. So the polis was really essential in creating and inventing the phalanx. One quick note on immortality. The Greeks did not believe in immortality in the Christian sense. The fact is, you just died, but the only way to achieve immortality was through your name. That is, you had to fight for your polis. And if you did well, you would be honored and your name would be remembered. So it's the Greek version of immortality. You accomplish it through your deeds. So again, there is this emphasis on individualism. And at the same time, absolute loyalty to the state or polis. As more and more of these farmers participated in the military, they began to seek and gain a greater voice in the political process of the polis. The phalanx were infantrymen, and the type was heavy infantry. The Greeks referred to the infantrymen as the hoplite, and this derived from the name of the shield they carried, which was called the hoplon. I should point out that this was not an inexpensive hobby for the hoplite. The polis did not provide any armor, so it was up to the hoplite on an individual basis to provide his own equipment. Therefore, if you were poor, you had no chance to participate in the phalanx, and therefore you had no chance to participate in the political process. So this was restricted to the wealthy. The Greek phalanx did not use cavalry nearly as much as their Persian adversaries. I should point out really quickly that the Spartans also are the only exception to this idea of the farmer hoplite. The Spartans had year-round professional soldiers, but we will get to the Spartans in another video. That's for another day. Okay, so let's move on and talk about the equipment of each soldier. The central core piece to the phalanx is the shield. As you can see in the diagram below, this is no small shield, but one that covers a majority of the hoplite's body. It weighed around 20 pounds and was at least 3 feet across. It's fundamentally made from a heavy wood, so you can imagine the effort needed to tote this thing around. Sometimes the shield had leather or bronze sheet across it. The inside of the shield contained 2 leather grips that allowed the bearer to have total control of the piece. And as I mentioned before, the name of the shield was the hoplon. So the size of the shield and all this armor made the Phalanx primarily defensive in its nature. The helmet was typically made of bronze and weighed around 5 pounds. The typical helmet was called the Corinthian helmet. This totally covered the entire head. Such helmets were among the warrior's most prized possessions and often passed from father to son. The infantryman would also have a breastplate that weighed perhaps as much as 40 pounds. There were also greaves that the hoplite put around his shins. So all of this cover gave the hoplite at least some type of armor from head to toe. The primary weapon was the spear or pike, depending on what you want to call it. Now, you did not throw this spear, but you thrusted it. The idea here is that you're going to try to kill as many of the enemy as you can and hold on to this as long as possible before it breaks. And then you're going to switch to either a dagger or a short sword. And the tip was usually made of iron, but sometimes bronze. Okay, so let's move on to the Phalanx formation. The composition of the Phalanx consisted of a square block or rectangle. It was around 4 to 8 ranks deep, depending on how many infantrymen were available to pull us at that time. Now, as we mentioned before, the shield was 3 feet across. So all of these hoplites together locked all of their shields together, making almost an impenetrable barrier. They would stand very close together to make a solid block of soldiers, and this maintained the integrity of the line. As a result, it's critical that the line marches together when approaching a battle in order to maintain this all-essential cohesion. Because of this, Greek hoplite formations always looked to fight on the few open plains in Greece. Fighting on uneven ground was generally avoided since this tended to break up the close cohesion of the Phalanx. Battles did not last long, sometimes in just 30 minutes, as hoplite soldiers needed to return home to work their farm. Now, hoplite versus hoplite was usually very bloody, but numbers count. If you had more ranks than the other Phalanx, you had a big-time advantage, but it is not necessarily the decisive advantage. Now, if you go to hoplite versus non-hoplite warfare, the Greeks almost never lost any scenarios like that. They simply mowed down an enemy like a tank and usually won quite easily. So you can imagine that they're in this almost impenetrable block of soldiers, and there's these irregular formations that are approaching them, and they just mowed them over, like I said. This lasted right up into Roman times when the Roman legion finally defeated the Phalanx, but these Greek hoplites of that time period were clearly not of the same caliber of infantrymen centuries earlier. One thing quickly about age, the age of the hoplite was between around 20 all the way up to even age 60. And we have to imagine that most of the front lines consisted of younger men, given the intensity and tenacity of the fighting that was involved. Okay, so let's move on to the Phalanx battle and tactics. So leading up to the battle, each side will offer up sacrifices to the various gods they hope to curry favor with. Usually these battles took place in the morning, so a hearty breakfast was consumed. To eliminate fear, wine would also be consumed. And after that, the soldiers broke camp and advanced in a slow march to the battle site. Now, the position of honor was always on the right-hand side, and you worked your way down the line to the left. The commander of the Phalanx was also on the right side. So the cream of the crop was always on the right. The main tactic was to shatter the cohesion of the enemy on one side, especially the enemy's weaker left flank. You can see this in the diagram below on the right, where the strong right is attempting to destroy the enemy's left. Now, if you could break the enemy's left, you could roll up the center flanks and cause serious disarray, and then force the enemy into retreat. The side that had its formation broken usually ended up losing the battle. Therefore, preservation of the formation was of the highest importance. So if your soldiers at the front line start dying, it's absolutely imperative that the second rank soldier fill that void and close the line as fast as possible. Otherwise, the enemy will occupy that space and start forming a wedge into your own line. And at that point, there is a distinct possibility that the rest of the guys will say the heck with this and start running for their lives, especially after they see their best troops falling in combat. I can imagine that when a formation lost heart, it probably happened very fast, perhaps in just moments. And when this happened, an army would be at its most vulnerable, and the most casualties were always suffered when retreating. The losing side had to seek terms of the victor's choosing. And even worse, the losing side had to ask permission to collect the dead and bury their own fallen soldiers. So it's very clear after these types of engagements who wins and who loses, as the loser has to humble themselves before the victor. Now let's go back to the formation for 1 minute here before we end this video. There were later attempts to intentionally overload one side of your formation to give it a maximum shock value. That is, they would overload one side in an attempt to rout the enemy flank as quick as possible. We call this an oblique formation. So if you look at the diagram on the left, you can see this gigantic block of Boeotians, which is 50 ranks deep. So how on earth are you going to take that down? And even that tactic shattered the Spartan right flank, which was totally unprepared for this new style of warfare. Okay, I'd like to go over a few more tidbits here before we close this video out. I want to point out that the early Greek phalanx was far different than the later phalanx that we see near Roman times. And remember I said that citizen farmers made up the phalanx. Well, that starts to change, especially around Alexander's time, where we see more professionals and mercenaries being incorporated into the ranks. That is, Alexander needed to conduct long-term campaigns in Persia, so there was just simply no chance to return back to Macedonia anytime soon. So these become year-round professional soldiers that Alexander not only pays, but he also splits the booty with. We will also see Greek mercenaries hired by several different kingdoms outside of Greece. And why not? These were the best soldiers in the world during this epoch. And even Persia will hire these guys to fight other Greeks because they can't rely on their own troops, especially up front. There is also a movement towards more specialization. That is, we start to see troops with a single purpose. So we'll start to see slingers and light troops. Some troops will fire missiles off before the heavy infantry gets involved. Now, as I mentioned before, the phalanx was the dominant military formation throughout the classical Greek period, and it absolutely annihilated the Persians and several other opposing forces that took it on. But it did have some inherent weaknesses that would be exposed later on, especially by the Romans. The first weakness was the general was always out in front, and that was expected. So guys like Alexander, Leonidas, they'll always be out in front leading the charge. Now, the advantage of that is you're increasing morale by showing your troops that you won't ask them to do anything you won't do. But the problem with this is if the general dies, there's really nobody left, and the man with the plan is now dead. That's why the generals were required to do a lot of pre-planning, because once the phalanx was set in motion, that was it. They kind of had to go forward and there was no going back. And that leads me to the other weakness of the phalanx. It had no reserve system like the Roman three-line system. They basically marched one direction and that was it. They couldn't really change directions or go on uneven ground. And that made the phalanx very vulnerable because it couldn't turn to meet an enemy if it was coming from the side or even behind. It really could only march forward. And so that was a big-time weakness. And we see the Romans, who initially actually used the phalanx, toss it out because they found that very aspect very burdensome. So they moved to a three-line system where they had reserves so they could deploy them as need be. That's going to wrap it up. I hope you found this useful, and please be sure to check out my other videos on my History Den YouTube channel.